Whoa.
So this is it. Easter is here. And before we actually get started, I want to answer two dying questions that everyone is just dying to know. Man, I feel weird, like I'm the opener and then the main event is right after me. This is the pre-game and then it's like the game. And by the big game or the game, I mean you can go to FBClovis.com/live, little plug there. But here's the first answer to the first question everyone's been dying to know. So last week I put out a little question out there on Easter. It's like, oh, Easter is coming. Do you know what that means? And I got so many different responses. All, of course, were wrong. But I got responses like this. Stay inside? Oh, that Stephen is going to put on an Easter bunny suit? Candy? Steven is shaving his head? Listen, I can't go shaving my head. I don't know for how long I'm going to have this luscious great hair. Eggs and bunnies. And the sad thing is that even my wife guessed, and she guessed Reese's Pieces. I mean, come on. You're my wife. You should probably know this. But I want to give you a little hint before I actually give the answer away, because you might get it if I do. Just give me a second here to... There we go. Okay, you ready for the hint? Yeah. Or here, let me. Oh, hold on. Got another. Yeah, two. Okay, so here it comes. Bust these babies out. Yeah. White chucks, everybody. Easter means you get your white chucks out. And I don't know if you know how long I've been having those sitting in the box since Christmas. Thanks, Mom. Easter means you bring out your brand new white pair of chucks because, well, Jesus. This is actually funny to me because it's not like I'm actually going to be going anywhere in these because there's nowhere to actually go. But when we can actually go places, you better believe that you're going to see me in those brand new white pair of chucks, baby. And it's also funny because this reminds me of another story where a friend of mine was really concerned about getting a haircut. And I was like, why do you want a haircut so badly? He's like, well, I got to get ready for school. And then it hit me like a couple minutes later. I was like, don't you go to school online, bro? Anyways. But on to the second question that everyone is dying to know what the answer is to. And that question is, what will Stephen be talking about on Easter? And the answer to that is an easy one because it's the same thing I always talk about on Easter. The resurrection. He is risen.
He is risen. He is risen.
He is risen. He is risen. Yes, he is risen. He is risen indeed. And this is why I love talking about the resurrection, because the resurrection is the answer to one of the most important questions you can ask about Jesus, which is, who is he? And my prayer really is that we would all eventually sit down and ask ourselves that question. Who is Jesus? You see, the reason why the resurrection points us to the answer of who is Jesus is because that's what it did for all these first century Jews. These Jewish monotheistic temple-going people turned their lives around radically because of what Jesus did. I mean, sure, they still had one God, but that God was Jesus. And sure, they still had the temple, but what the temple pointed to was everything that Jesus did. And sure, they were still Jewish, but it wasn't about who they were, but it was more about whose they were. The resurrection was the single event that caused all these Jewish people to leave everything they grew up with and join this new movement that Jesus was bringing. And it wasn't about what you could do. It wasn't about what you could bring, but it was all about what he did for us. But before we get in too far, let me remind you of what was going on just a few days before 2,000 years ago. So Jesus was going from city to city, teaching all these teachings, and he was building this following, and things were going great. People were loving him. People were loving the things that he would bring. And his 12 closest friends, his disciples, were like, well, this is a good thing, because when Jesus looks good, we look good. And they were actually fighting over who would be on his left and who would be on his right when he is seated king. And they were wondering, like, how is this all going to look for us? Like, what do we get out of this? But then things started to change when Jesus started teaching these hard teachings. He started teaching things like, drink my blood and eat my flesh. If you don't do these things, you have no part of the kingdom. And when people heard this, they really said, this is hard teaching. Who can accept this? And for the disciples, it was this wake-up call for them, because they either had to be all in or all out. Because what scripture tells us next is that after he taught this hard teaching, after they're like, oh my gosh, this is hard, the thing that happened, they said that many turned away. That they've been following Jesus and they were liking everything that he did. But then this teaching comes along is, if you don't eat my flesh, if you don't drink my blood, then you don't have any part of me. And it says that many turned away. But for these closest followers, the disciples, I mean, Jesus looks back at them and says, are you going to turn away also? And Peter steps up to the plate and he says, well, where else are we going to go? It was like at that point, they had seen too much. They had heard too much. They had fallen in love with him too much to be like, what else is there to really turn to? If we don't turn to you, who else are we going to go to? And after that happens, Jesus continues to go on and teach, and they have, a little bit of a good time. They're still confused of what's going on. But then Jesus starts talking about this death stuff again. And he says, listen, where I'm going, you can't go. I'm going to have to die for everybody. And this is when Peter kind of says, Jesus, what's with all this death stuff? Let's talk about something else. Let's get the crowd behind us again. You don't really have to talk about this, do you? Stop being a little downer and give us a little pick-me-up. Okay, maybe he didn't say all of that, but he did say some of that. Then finally, at this Passover meal, Jesus lays it all out for them. And he says, listen, I'm not going to be here forever, but I'm going to leave a helper to help you guys. And this helper, he's going to help you love the way that I have loved you. And if you don't know what happens next, this is the part where they leave that dinner and Jesus gets arrested and he gets put on trial and then he gets charged and then he gets crucified. And I don't know if you can guess where all of his friends were at that moment, but I'll tell you, they were nowhere to be found. They were afraid and they ran and they hid. I mean, Peter, this guy who said, I'll never leave your side, denies him 3 times before the morning even happens. A junior high school girl calls him out and he's like, I don't know that guy, because he's afraid. And right after his death, everyone scatters. And I can tell you the question that continues to run through their mind is this: who was he? Who is Jesus? And I'm sure they're mulling things over and they're like, well, was he just a teacher? Was he just a prophet? Was he just a miracle worker? Like, who was this guy? Sure, I look back and he had all these party tricks, but could he really have been God? Because why would God do this? Why would he just leave us like that? This doesn't make any sense. I thought I knew who he was, but maybe he wasn't who I thought. And for some of you, or maybe even people this is the same response when it comes to Jesus, that yeah, he might have been a good teacher. He might have even been a prophet. He might have just been a moral good guy. But God, I don't know about that. But him being the creator of the universe, maybe not. And this is why the resurrection is so important, not only for those first century Jews, but for us now. Because again, the resurrection points us to the answer of who Jesus was. And so for 3 days after his death, all of his disciples are still thinking about these questions, wrestling with not only the death of their friend, but everything they had seen and everything they were taught. I mean, how was he able to have such great teachings? How was he able to perform all of those miracles? Water into wine. How was he able to walk on water? How was he able to calm the storm? How was he able to heal the blind, the sick, the lame, the demon possessed, multiply fish and bread twice, call Lazarus from the grave? And they don't even know about the greatest miracle right around the corner, that their friend who is dead will soon raise himself out of that grave. And here's the kicker. When they saw their friend, they didn't believe it. They thought he was a ghost, but he sat with them and he ate with them and he talked with them. And it was after that they witnessed Jesus rising from the dead, that this alive person who once was dead was right in front of them. They had the courage and the boldness to go back to those places that they were afraid to go in. Because here's the thing that I don't want you to forget about. The reason they hid and the reason they were afraid, because they just saw their leader arrested and killed. And you know what happens next? They go after the followers. And so they were fearful. But when they came in contact with the risen Christ, they were able to go back to those places that they were afraid to go in, where they thought they had to hide, where they were just in fear of their lives, and preach a simple message. And guess what they taught? It wasn't what Jesus taught. It wasn't the teachings of Jesus. And stop to think about that for a second. When you think of every other world religion, it's all about what their leader taught. But when it comes to Christianity, it's not about what Jesus, the leader, taught. It was all about who he was. Again, this question of who is Jesus is super important. And when they went from city to city, running into religious leader after religious leader, running into person after person who cried, crucify him, they had a simple 3-part message. And that message was, Jesus died, you killed him, and God raised him. And to be honest, when we look at the teachings of Jesus, those religious teachings aren't very different from those of other religious leaders or other gurus. But the thing that separates them the most is that their leaders are all dead, where ours is still alive, that he was able to raise himself from the dead. Everything depends on the resurrection. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And this is the great thing about Jesus' life and resurrection, is that we can know that this actually happened. And it's not just because the Bible tells me so. It's way, way, way better than that. We know this from eyewitness testimony. People like this tax collector who followed Jesus around and he wrote down everything that he witnessed, and his name happened to be Matthew. Or this guy who followed Peter around and Peter gave him all the information he needed to know. And remember, Peter is the guy who denied Jesus 3 times, who messed up a whole bunch. And so this guy follows Peter and he says, listen, what is it that I need to know? What is it that I need to write down? And he writes it down, and his name happens to be Mark. Or there's this doctor who goes from region to region asking all these questions, saying, listen, I need to know who this Jesus character was. What did he actually do? And he meets enough people and comes to the conclusion that Jesus actually lived, and he died, and he rose again. And this guy's name happened to be Luke. But more than that, you look at Peter, again, this guy who messed up so much, and there's so much documentation about him doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. He writes 2 letters to the churches that we know of. And in these letters, he again writes that Jesus lived and he died and he rose again. And this is what it all depends on. And more than that, I think of the brother of Jesus, James, this guy who didn't believe, who saw miracles and said, cool party trick, bro, but I don't believe ya. And it wasn't until after the resurrection that James said, this is my Lord and Savior. And I love this question of what would it take for your brother or your sister to convince you that they were the Son of God? For James, it was Jesus dying and then raising himself up from the dead. And if you feel like you can't trust these guys because they were too close to the action, well, here's a list of people who aren't Christian who cite Jesus and what he did and how he influenced the people around him. But here's the main point that I want you to walk away with. In the resurrection, we find the answer to who is Jesus. That he's not just a prophet, that he's not just a teacher, that he's just not a moral guy who's walking around with all these great teachings. I mean, if he had died and stayed dead, then yes, that's all you have. But because he raised himself from the dead, you have this God-man flexing a little bit and proving that he is who he says he is. You see, on the cross, Jesus willingly took all the sickness, the pain, and the blame. But more than that, he took the punishment and the separation from God that we all deserve. But on the flip side of things, in the resurrection, he gives us redemption and restoration, that he gives us life empowered to defeat death. And when we embrace this gift, we see how the resurrected Jesus is resurrecting us. Listen, you can follow the teachings of Jesus and it'll make your life better. But if you follow Jesus, you'll have life. So again, my prayer is that we would all sit down and ask that question, who is Jesus? And if you're looking for an answer, I would encourage you to look into the resurrection, because that is where you find the answer to who is Jesus. Thanks and have a blessed day, guys.